Hello, my name's Simon Pittman, and with my colleague Lisa Wedding, the director of the Oxford Seascape Ecology Lab, we are both delighted to have the opportunity to explain our perspective on what is seascape ecology and how can seascape ecology help us to advance solution-orientated science for addressing complex challenges in sustainable development. The ocean is a critical life support system, and we are increasingly turning to the ocean for solutions to address sustainable food production and food security, renewable energy needs, carbon sequestration and storage to mitigate accelerated global warming, and for the blue health benefits that come from spending time near or in the ocean. More than ever, we now understand the ocean as a complex, dynamic and interconnected system that is increasingly vulnerable to our activities. In response to uncertainty and growing concern over planetary changes, huge investments and rapid advances have been made in our Earth observation capacity, now delivering hundreds of terabytes of data per day. It's exciting to be at the beginning of a geospatial data revolution that is rapidly closing the ocean data gap and improving technology, data processing, and the quality and availability of data. But, and there's always a but, we lag behind in our ability to deliver ecologically meaningful information at scales that are operationally relevant for management and conservation efforts. To address the so-called DRIP syndrome, data-rich, information and insight poor, investment is currently urgently needed in innovative solution-focused decision support frameworks that are more integrative, ecological, spatially explicit and multi-scale to inform transformative actions towards regenerative and sustainable development goals. The widening gap between data acquisition and the generation of practical insights highlighted by the DRIP phenomenon does not diminish the value of spatial data acquisition, and it's certainly not stopping us from taking action. Globally, we are increasingly investing in place-based strategies such as protected areas, spatial planning, and actively restoring marine ecosystems using best available information. Ambitious global targets have been set to halt biodiversity loss, mitigate climate change and safeguard human and planetary well-being. But in the race for targets, we've often failed to optimise actions due to inappropriate or insufficient evidence-based decision support. As the work of ecologists continues to influence biodiversity policy, the questions that practitioners are required to address are increasingly falling in the realm of landscape and seascape ecology. Seascape ecology means different things to different people. In this presentation, we'll explain what is seascape ecology from our perspective and why is it a distinct way of thinking and working. We simplify a wide variety of themes into what we refer to here as the 4 C's: seascape context, configuration, connectivity, and consideration of scale, and touch on some applications. In another talk, Lisa will introduce a 5th C, C for culture, with a social, ecological evolution of the science that we are calling cultural seascape ecology. Then we provide a few results from a recent Global Horizon scan published last year that integrated the opinions of both leading seascape ecologists and conservation practitioners to identify and rank research priorities needed to inform management actions in this UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. So what is seascape ecology? Sometimes it seems easier to say what it's not rather than what it is. In general, however, we consider seascape ecology to be the application of landscape ecology to the marine environment. In fact, many of the early adopters of landscape ecology refer to their study areas as marine landscapes and their practice as marine landscape ecology. Without doubt, seascape ecology is a pattern-oriented, quantitative study of ecological causes and consequences, with a focus on linking structure and function and examining change in the structure-function relationships. It's a fusion of ecology with geographical and geospatial sciences and sometimes socio-ecological systems thinking. Seascape ecology recognises marine environments as patchy in time and space, that's marine heterogeneity, and recognises that drivers of ecosystem structure and function operate and interact across scales, often in non-linear ways and exhibiting scale dependency. Like landscape ecology, seascape ecology provides concepts and tools to quantify patterns at multiple scales. Many of these tools have come directly from landscape ecology and are more commonly applied to terrestrial systems. There's also an evolution of metrics for marine systems. Seascape ecology, like landscape ecology, is integrative across disciplines and very much solution focused. We still tend to refer to seascape ecology as an emerging science, and that's because although elements of landscape ecology are increasingly applied and heterogeneous spaces in the ocean are increasingly referred to as seascapes, there is not yet sufficient growth to warrant a dedicated journal of seascape ecology. There are no master's programs dedicated to seascape ecology, and only a handful of research labs globally focus primarily on seascape ecology. That said, at Oxford we're in the process of developing a seascape ecology graduate module and hope to change the balance there. Awareness of seascape ecology is growing in the practitioner community, where the placement and design of ecologically effective protected areas and networks of protected areas and the scaling up of coastal restoration requires reliable, spatially explicit information on context, configuration and ecological connectivity at a range of spatial scales. Historically, it's important to recognise that the roots of modern landscape ecology evolved through progress in studying complexity in both terrestrial and marine environments. This river of thinkers diagram provides a potted history of the development of ideas underpinning seascape ecology before it was called seascape ecology. In the 1930s, the biogeographer Carl Troll introduced the term landscape ecology. And in his work he had examined the spatial patterns and processes in mangrove ecosystems with the help of some of the earliest examples of coastal vegetation mapping. In the 1960s, the theory of island biogeography was tested on mangrove islands by David Simbaloff and the late E.O. Wilson. In the 70s, Bob Payne and Simon Levin conducted detailed studies on intertidal assemblages to understand the dynamics of biogenic patch mosaics. In the Caribbean, John Ogden documented fish migrations, highlighting the importance of considering connected mosaics of patch types in the functioning of coral reef ecosystems. In 1989, the oceanographer John Steele authored the first marine paper in the journal Landscape Ecology, where he coined the term ocean landscapes to capture the heterogeneity of the ocean, and his earlier work on plankton patchiness contributed to the development of early concepts in patch dynamics. These researchers were all pioneers of modern landscape ecology and ecology in general. It was not until 1991 that Carlton Ray and John Magnuson first made the case for the application of landscape ecology to the ocean and called this seascape ecology rather than marine landscape ecology. Since then, many researchers, particularly in the US and Australia, such as Dave Eggleston with oyster reefs, Susan Bell with seagrasses and Ron Neeb with salt marshes, have applied landscape ecology thinking to shallow marine environments to test theories and concepts through pioneering experiments and observations. So let's now focus on the 4 C's of seascape ecology: context, configuration, connectivity, and the consideration of scale. Context in seascape ecology is the recognition and measurement of what is happening or what has happened outside of the focal scale, and that this matters to the focal site. Hence the simple premise: local conditions are influenced by attributes of the surroundings. This can be the surrounding seascape or landscape, and can include biophysical patterns or cultural patterns or both, where the spatial and temporal window of interest will depend on the question being asked. If the historical dynamics are important, then the researcher will need to determine how far back to go. Similarly with the spatial extent. Context is one of the key justifications for a multi-scale analysis. Locations have unique properties and some ecological relationships are context dependent, which limits generalizations and model transferability. For example, two patches of mangrove with similar structural properties in the same bioregion can have very different characteristics when we consider the surrounding landscape structure in which they are embedded. As seascape ecologists, we advocate that patch context should be accounted for in ecological studies, and especially in comparative analyses among multiple sites. Seascape configuration is the physical arrangement of objects in space, and whether measuring benthic structure or sea surface structure, the configuration can be represented as either a 2D horizontal patch mosaic or some higher dimensional digital terrain. Patches and patch mosaics and terrains and ecotones vary in their structural morphology in time and space, and the ecological relevance of these pattern-process relationships will likely vary with the scale of analysis. However, the key premise in seascape ecology is that spatial configuration influences ecological processes in ways that would be different if the spatial configuration were different. The central challenge, therefore, for seascape ecology is to understand how structure and structural change influence ecological processes, and how ecological processes influence structure. For example, different structures have different patterns of permeability with regard to the movement of organisms and exchange of materials. It's clear that structural configuration influences habitat quality and the flow of ecosystem services. So a focus on structure can be a useful way of creating spatial proxies or surrogates to inform conservation strategies where patterns of processes are not so easily mapped. Fortunately, we have unprecedented access to maps of benthic seascape structure and a wide variety of pattern metrics that can quantify the 2D horizontal spatial arrangement of patches in patch mosaics, and surface metrics that can quantify surface morphology of spatial gradients represented in 2.5D or 3D terrains. It has been said that connectivity is everything. All is flux, nothing is stationary, said the Greek philosopher Heraclitus. The Hawaiian word pilina communicates the positive value of connection. The ocean system has strong pilina, and we have strong pilina with the ocean. Ecological connectivity is the movement of organisms and materials between locations, and our premise in seascape ecology is that connectivity is critical to living systems. Understanding what makes an ecosystem productive requires knowledge on all of the pieces, how they are connected, and the processes determining the direction and rates of flow of nutrients, individuals, biomass, ecological functions. For organisms, seascape connectivity has been described as a complex product of structural properties that hinder or enable movements, including patch quality, boundary type, patch context. It is also affected by the distance between locations and obviously by the movement characteristics of the features of interest. With regard to connectivity conservation, we now see connectivity featuring in the language of high-level global biodiversity conservation policy. It has always been central to the Convention on Migratory Species, but has more recently also featured as well-connected networks of protected areas in Aichi Target 11, and subsequently carried through into the Convention on Biological Diversity's post-2020 framework. The IUCN has a Marine Connectivity Conservation Working Group, and we encourage you to join us. To support implementation, we need to step up efforts to identify corridors and barriers to movements to ensure that we can take action to keep animals and plants moving in the ways that they need to in order to survive and remain healthy. Scale selection and scale effects permeate all themes and all methodologies in seascape ecology, as they do in landscape ecology. Although scale dependence exists, there's no such thing as a seascape scale, and it's very unlikely to be a single scale that considers sufficient variability to explain the ecology of a species or a system of interest. Hence, in seascape ecology, a key premise is that organisms respond to their environment in different ways and at different scales. Likewise, there's no such thing as a seascape level study. The space-time domains shown in this graph represent a caricature of the multiple overlapping scales for a range of important oceanographic features and processes, including the domains within which marine protected area management is typically implemented. Individuals and species are likely to respond to a hierarchy of such patterns and processes operating and interacting across scales in time and space. Scale selection in ecological science needs a far more convincing justification than is currently the norm. So where should seascape ecologists focus efforts to better support actions for a more sustainable and regenerative future? Well, this was the goal of our paper published last year. We collaborated with a team of leading marine ecologists to formulate applied research questions, and then we used an online Delphi method and invited both academic ecologists and senior conservation practitioners to select their priorities to help derive a group ranking of the research priorities and themes. A total of 128 questions were submitted. Many of those questions were fairly similar with large overlap in the content, and these were consolidated to reduce the number of questions from 128 to a short list of 55. On the graph here on the right hand side, you can see that the initial questions submitted in blue, and then the curated questions with minimal overlap in the orange bars. So there was quite a reduction there in the number of questions. This graph highlights where most of the forward thinking is focused, with most questions submitted for seascape change, seascape connectivity, and restoration and sustainability science. A greater diversity in the questions within each theme resulted in less overlap, and therefore greater retention of individual questions. For example, questions grouped under the ecosystem-based management theme were relatively diverse, compared with questions on spatial and temporal scale and seascape connectivity, which had greater overlap. Some questions received agreement and some divergence of opinion between academic scientists and conservation practitioners on the relative importance of each question. When we compared the opinions of priority research questions between the two respondent groups, we found that highest agreement was on those questions that were considered the lowest tier. That's the light blue area of the graph showing all 55 questions. And we found 50% agreement between practitioners and academic ecologists in the highest priority tier. That said, overall, 65% of research questions were within a plus or minus 10% band of agreement. And the questions with the greatest divergence in priority between respondent groups are highlighted here in red. The full list of research questions are provided in the supplementary materials with the open access paper published in Marine Ecology Progress Series last year. If we just take a quick look at the top 3 questions listed here, starting with the practitioners first, we can see that some of the divergence in opinion appears to be associated with practitioners voting for the more operationally relevant science, associated with, for example, monitoring and assessment, reporting, metrics and indicators, and the science that can inform management strategies. In fact, both groups agree on placing priority on conservation prioritisation and the design of management strategies. Somewhat unexpected was a difference in rank for a question on the consequences of climate change, which was ranked more highly by academic scientists than practitioners. The biggest divergence between opinions was with question 46. What methods are most effective for linking spatial characteristics of the seascape to social, cultural and ecosystem service values that are meaningful to management practitioners and communities? And this highlights the greater emphasis on cultural consequences of seascapes by the practitioner group here. Please do refer to the paper for more interpretation of the most divergent opinions. Seascape ecology is emerging as a science capable of bridging the gap between ecological sciences and conservation practice, and will continue to do so. There are a number of things we can do to support the impact of seascape ecology. We can continue to build the evidence base linking spatial patterns to ecological processes across multiple spatial and temporal scales. And we can improve awareness of seascape ecology in the practitioner community. One of the results that emerged from the expert consultation was that almost half of the management practitioner respondents had a relatively low knowledge with or familiarity with seascape ecology, and only a relatively small amount, 16%, considered to have themselves to have expert knowledge of seascape ecology. We can co-create projects with practitioners to demonstrate seascape ecology thinking. We can work in a transdisciplinary way, and we can continue to integrate the latest technological developments, explore the consequences for human cultures through systems science, and Lisa will talk more about this in the same session. And we can promote data sharing and digital tools. And then I encourage you to consider the research questions presented in the Pittman et al. Paper published last year, and see if there's anything there that you that takes your interest and could advance the application of seascape ecology. I'd just like to leave you with this final thought. Personally, I see seascape ecology as a paradigm shift from conventional approaches in marine ecology. Seascape ecologists perceive the marine environment differently and ask different questions, apply different concepts and often different tools that are measuring different patterns, and so the interpretation of those patterns is also different. Mahalo, and thank you for listening.